Sometimes the hardest part about caring for others is forgetting to care for yourself. After 37 years of healing broken hearts and mending wounded animals, Dr. Marjorie Lane thought she'd seen it all. That Tuesday morning seemed ordinary. Enough! Charlie, an 11-year-old golden retriever, needed a simple lump removed. His owner, Frank, a widower about her age, sat nervously in the waiting room while Marjorie prepared for what should have been routine surgery. But when she made the first cut, what she found inside that lump wasn't what any textbook had prepared her for. It was something that would force her to face a truth she'd been avoiding about her own health for years. The discovery would change everything for both the dog and his worried owner. But most of all, it would teach Marjorie that healing sometimes starts with having the courage to be vulnerable. What could be hiding inside that seemed so harmless on the surface? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of Lane Veterinary Clinic, casting familiar patterns across the worn linoleum floor. Dr. Marjorie Lane had walked these halls for nearly 4 decades, her footsteps echoing with the same purposeful rhythm that had greeted countless anxious pet owners and their beloved companions. At 62, Marjorie carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had delivered difficult news with compassion and performed miracles with steady hands. Her greying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her white coat bore the subtle stains of a life dedicated to healing. The antique leather medical bag sitting on her desk had belonged to her grandmother, Dr. Eleanor Lane, one of the first female veterinarians in the state. It was a reminder of the legacy she carried, the expectations she'd spent her lifetime fulfilling. "Morning, Dr. Lane," Sarah called from the reception desk. At 55, Sarah Henderson had been answering phones and soothing worried pet parents. For 15 years, she knew every family in their small Missouri town of Millbrook, remembered every pet's birthday, and could predict which owners would need extra tissues before Marjorie even began her examination. "Good morning, Sarah. How's your mother feeling?" "Better, thanks to you. That arthritis medication you suggested for Duchess is working wonders. Mom swears her old girl is acting like a puppy again." Marjorie smiled, the kind of genuine warmth that came from watching 3 generations of the same family trust her with their most precious companions. This was what she lived for, these small victories, these moments of relief and joy that punctuated the more difficult aspects of veterinary medicine. Mike Thompson, her 28-year-old veterinary technician, emerged from the back room, carrying supplies for the morning's first surgery. Fresh out of school, with eager eyes and steady hands, he reminded Marjorie of herself at that age, though she'd never possessed his easy confidence with people. Mike had a gift for calming nervous animals and their equally nervous owners, something that had taken Marjorie decades to develop. "Charlie Morrison's here for his 9 o'clock, Mike announced, checking the schedule on his tablet. "Pre-surgical. Blood work came back normal. Should be straightforward." Marjorie nodded, already mentally preparing for the routine lump removal. Charlie was one of her favorites, a gentle golden retriever who'd been coming to the clinic since he was a puppy. His owner, Frank Morrison, was a retired high school English teacher who'd moved to Millbrook 5 years ago after his wife passed away. Frank treated Charlie like the child he and his wife had never been able to have. The clinic had been Marjorie's world for so long that she sometimes forgot there was life beyond its walls. Her small house on Elm Street sat just 10 minutes away, filled with medical journals, classical music records, and the quiet solitude she'd grown accustomed to over the years. She'd never married, never had children of her own. The animals she'd treated and the families she'd served had filled that space, or so she'd convinced herself. Dr. Eleanor Lane's portrait hung in Marjorie's office, a stern-faced woman in wire-rimmed glasses who'd opened the clinic in 1952. Marjorie's father, Dr. Robert Lane, had taken over in 1975, and Marjorie had joined him fresh out of veterinary school in 1988. When her father retired, she'd naturally assumed leadership, carrying forward the Lane family tradition of compassionate animal care. But lately, something had been different. Not with her work. She was as skilled and dedicated as ever. It was something deeper. Something she'd been pushing aside with the same determination she'd used to build her career. The persistent fatigue that no amount of coffee could cure. The shortness of breath when climbing the stairs to her apartment. Above the clinic's storage room, where she sometimes spent the night during busy seasons. The way her heart sometimes raced during routine procedures, as if her body was trying to tell her something her mind refused to acknowledge. She'd been meaning to schedule her own medical checkup for months, maybe years. The reminder cards from Dr. Patterson's office sat in a neat pile on her kitchen counter, each one representing another postponed appointment, another excuse about being too busy, too needed at the clinic. It was easier to focus on everyone else's health than to confront her own mortality. The bell above the front door chimed, and Frank Morrison entered with Charlie padding beside him. At 65, Frank had the weathered look of someone who'd lived through both joy and sorrow. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and he wore the kind of comfortable cardigan that suggested a man who'd embraced retirement with grace. Charlie's golden coat showed the signs of his 11 years, with grey around his muzzle and a slower gait than Marjorie remembered from his younger days. "Good morning, Frank. How's our patient feeling?" Frank's smile carried the mixture of affection and worry that Marjorie knew well. "He's been his usual self, but that lump seems to have grown a bit since last month. I probably should have brought him in sooner." "Don't worry," Marjorie assured him, crouching down to greet Charlie with gentle hands. "We caught it early, and from what I can feel, it should be very straightforward. These fatty lipomas are quite common in older dogs." Charlie's tail wagged weakly as she examined him, his trusting brown eyes looking up at her with the kind of faith that still moved her after all these years. Animals had a way of seeing straight through to your heart, accepting your care without question or judgment. People were far more complicated. "I'll be honest, Doc," Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of recent loss. "Since Helen passed, Charlie's been my closest companion. I don't know what I'd do if something happened to him." Marjorie understood that particular brand of devotion. She'd watched countless clients form bonds with their pets that transcended ordinary affection, especially those who lived alone. Charlie wasn't just Frank's dog. He was his family, his daily routine, his reason to get up each morning. "We're going to take excellent care of him," she promised, meaning every word. "The procedure should take about 30 minutes, and he'll be ready to go home this afternoon." As Sarah handled the paperwork and Mike prepared Charlie for surgery, Marjorie retreated to her office for a few minutes of quiet preparation. She'd performed hundreds of lump removals over the years. This should be routine, almost meditative, in its familiarity. Yet something nagged at the edge of her consciousness, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Her grandmother's leather bag sat open on her desk, its brass clasps worn smooth by decades of use. Inside were instruments that had saved countless lives, tools that had been passed down through 3 generations of Lane veterinarians. Eleanor Lane had faced challenges that Marjorie could barely imagine, practicing medicine as a woman in the 1950s, proving herself worthy of respect in a male-dominated field, building a reputation one successful case at a time. Marjorie had inherited that strength, that dedication, but she'd also inherited something else, the Lane family tendency to put everyone else's needs first. Her grandmother had died at her desk, still seeing patients at age 78. Her father had worked until the day before his retirement, never taking the vacation time he'd earned. The Lane women, it seemed, were caretakers by nature and martyrs by choice. Mike knocked softly on her door. "We're ready when you are, Dr. Lane." She closed the medical bag with a soft click and followed him to the surgical suite, where Charlie lay peacefully under light sedation. The lump was visible on his right flank, about the size of a golf ball and seemingly well-defined. Everything about it suggested a routine fatty deposit, the kind she could remove in her sleep. Frank had settled into the waiting room with a cup of Sarah's coffee and yesterday's newspaper, though Marjorie doubted he'd be able to concentrate on reading. Waiting was always the hardest part, especially for someone who'd already experienced loss. As she scrubbed her hands and prepared her instruments, Marjorie felt the familiar calm that came with entering her professional element. This was where she belonged, where everything made sense. In surgery, there were no complicated emotions or unaddressed personal issues, just the clear, focused work of healing. She made her first incision with practiced precision, expecting to find exactly what she diagnosed. But as the scalpel parted Charlie's skin and the lump became visible, something inside her chest tightened. This wasn't what she'd expected at all. The mass was unlike anything she'd encountered in 37 years of practice, and the sight of it made her hands tremble in a way they never had before, because what she was looking at reminded her, with startling clarity, of something she'd been ignoring about her own body for far too long. Marjorie stared at the exposed mass in Charlie's flank, her surgical instruments suddenly feeling foreign in her hands. What she'd expected to be a simple fatty lipoma was something else entirely. A complex, multicolored growth with characteristics she'd never seen before. The tissue had an unusual marbled appearance, with sections that seemed almost crystalline under the surgical lights. "Mike," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Could you come take a look at this?" Her young technician moved to her side, his usual cheerful expression shifting to concern as he peered into the surgical site. "That's not what we expected, is it?" "No, it's not." Marjorie carefully examined the mass without disturbing it further. "I need to photograph this before we proceed. And call Dr. Stevens at the university. I want a pathologist's opinion before we continue." While Mike prepared the camera and placed the call, Marjorie stepped back from the table, pulling off her gloves with hands that trembled slightly. In all her years of practice, she'd prided herself on being able to diagnose most conditions by sight and touch. This unknown entity challenged everything she thought she knew about veterinary medicine, but it was more than professional uncertainty that shook her. The mass bore an unsettling resemblance to something she'd been feeling in her own abdomen for months, a firm, irregular growth that she'd convinced herself was nothing more than stress-related muscle tension. Looking at Charlie's condition, now that comfortable self-diagnosis seemed dangerously naive. "Dr. Stevens is in surgery, but his resident can look at the photos," Mike reported. "She said to send them over immediately." Marjorie documented the mass from multiple angles, her medical training taking over even as her personal fears mounted. The growth appeared to be encapsulated, which was encouraging, but its internal structure defied easy classification. Parts of it looked almost geological, like mineral deposits, while other sections resembled normal tissue. 20 minutes later, Dr. Stevens called back personally. "Marjorie, I've never seen anything quite like this. My best guess is some kind of rare metabolic deposit, possibly related to a genetic mutation or environmental exposure. You need to remove it completely and send it for comprehensive analysis." "What about Charlie's prognosis?" "Hard to say without knowing exactly what we're dealing with. But the fact that it appears encapsulated is promising. Remove it cleanly, and he should recover well." As Marjorie returned to the surgical table, her mind raced between professional concern for Charlie and growing personal anxiety. She began the delicate process of dissecting around the mass, taking care to preserve its integrity for analysis while ensuring she removed every trace of abnormal tissue. The growth came free more easily than she'd expected, as if it had been waiting to be discovered. As she placed it in the specimen container, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at a preview of her own future, a future she'd been avoiding by refusing to seek medical care. "There," she said to Mike as she began closing the incision. "Let's get this to the lab and Charlie back to recovery." But even as she sutured the surgical site with her usual precision, Marjorie's thoughts kept returning to her own symptoms. The fatigue that had been growing worse over the past year, the strange sensations in her abdomen that she'd attributed to stress and irregular eating, the way her body sometimes felt foreign to her, as if it were harboring secrets she wasn't ready to face. Charlie's recovery went smoothly, but Marjorie found herself checking on him more frequently than necessary, as if his healing could somehow predict her own fate. By afternoon, he was awake and alert, his tail wagging weakly when she entered his recovery kennel. Frank had spent the entire day at the clinic, reading the same newspaper page over and over while stealing glances at the treatment room door. When Marjorie finally emerged to speak with him, she saw her own anxiety reflected in his weathered features. "How is he, Doc?" "The surgery went well," she assured him, settling into the chair beside him. "But I have to be honest. The mass wasn't what I expected. We've sent it for analysis, and it may take a few days to get results." Frank's face paled. "Is it cancer?" "I don't think so, but I can't be certain until we have the pathology report. What I can tell you is that Charlie came through the surgery beautifully, and whatever this is, we caught it early. Can I see him?" "Of course." She led Frank to the recovery area, where Charlie lifted his head at the sound of his owner's voice. The reunion was gentle but emotional, Frank's careful hands stroking his companion's head while whispering words of comfort and love. "You're a tough old boy, aren't you?" Frank murmured. "We're going to get through this together." Watching them, Marjorie felt a sharp pang of loneliness that caught her by surprise. She'd witnessed thousands of these moments between pets and their people, but something about Frank's quiet devotion and Charlie's trusting response highlighted the absence of such connections in her own life. After Frank left with instructions for Charlie's aftercare, Marjorie found herself alone in the clinic for the first time that day. The specimen container sat in the laboratory refrigerator, waiting for its journey to the university pathology lab. Inside was a mystery that might change everything they understood about canine medicine, or it might simply be a very rare but benign condition. But Marjorie knew she couldn't wait for Charlie's results to address her own situation. The parallels were too striking, the timing too coincidental to ignore. She pulled out her phone and stared at Dr. Patterson's number, her finger hovering over the call button. The conversation would be awkward. "How do you tell your family physician that you've been avoiding medical care while dedicating your life to healing others? How do you explain that you've been feeling your own suspicious growth for months, but haven't sought treatment because you're too busy caring for everyone else?" She made the call. "Dr. Patterson's office, this is Jennifer." "Hello, Jennifer. This is Dr. Marjorie Lane. I need to schedule an appointment as soon as possible." "Of course, Dr. Lane. Is this urgent?" Marjorie looked at the specimen container one more time, thinking of Charlie's trusting eyes and Frank's worried face. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think it might be." The appointment was set for Friday morning, 3 days away. 3 days to wonder, to worry, and to face the possibility that her years of dedicated service to others had come at the expense of her own well-being. As she locked up the clinic that evening, Marjorie caught her reflection in the front door's glass. She looked older than she remembered, more fragile somehow. For 37 years, she'd been the strong one, the healer, the person others turned to in their darkest moments. Now, for the first time in her adult life, she was going to need someone else's strength. The thought terrified her almost as much as the mysterious growth that might be sharing space with Charlie's in the pathology lab. But as she walked to her car under the soft glow of the streetlights, Marjorie realized that facing her fears might be the first step toward truly healing, not just others, but herself. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the clinic. Frank Morrison arrived an hour before opening, carrying a thermos of coffee and a worn wooden recipe box that looked like it had seen decades of use. "I hope you don't mind," he said when Marjorie unlocked the front door. "I couldn't sleep, and I thought you might want some company while we wait for Charlie's results." Marjorie was touched by his thoughtfulness, though she wondered if he could sense her own anxiety beneath her professional composure. "That's very kind of you, Frank. How's Charlie feeling this morning?" "Resting comfortably. He ate his breakfast and even wagged his tail when I mentioned your name." Frank's smile was genuine but tinged with worry. "I brought something I wanted to show you." They settled in the small break room behind the reception area, where Frank opened the recipe box with gentle hands. Inside were dozens of index cards covered in neat handwriting, their edges yellowed with age and splattered with the evidence of countless meals prepared with love. "These were Helen's," he said quietly. 43 years of marriage, and she never made the same meal twice without consulting these cards. Even when she was sick toward the end, she'd still try to direct me from her chair in the kitchen. Marjorie studied the cards, noting the careful way each recipe was written, with modifications noted in different colored pens and personal observations scrawled in the margins. "Chicken and dumplings, Frank's favorite on rainy days," she read aloud from one card. "She knew you well, better than I knew myself sometimes." Frank's voice carried the particular ache of someone still learning to navigate life alone. "Helen always said I was too stubborn to take care of myself properly. She'd probably have dragged me to the doctor years ago if she'd seen me ignoring the warning signs I've been pretending don't exist." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Marjorie looked up from the recipe cards, seeing something familiar in Frank's weathered features, the same careful mask she wore when avoiding uncomfortable truths about her own well-being. "What kind of warning signs?" she asked gently. Frank was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the recipe box. "The usual things you tell yourself aren't important when you're my age. Fatigue that doesn't go away with rest. Aches that seem to move around for no good reason. Helen used to say I was the worst patient she'd ever seen, always diagnosing everyone else's problems while ignoring my own." "That sounds familiar," Marjorie admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "Does it? I suppose we're both in the business of taking care of others. Helen was a school nurse for 30 years before she retired. She had that same instinct you have, always putting everyone else's needs first." They sat in comfortable silence, sharing the coffee Frank had brought, while the morning sun painted geometric patterns on the break room floor. There was something healing about this quiet companionship, this mutual recognition of shared fears and postponed self-care. "Can I ask you something?" Frank said eventually. "Of course. When was the last time you had a thorough medical checkup? Not just the routine things, but a real examination by someone who knows what to look for." The question was asked with such gentle concern that Marjorie found herself answering honestly instead of deflecting with humor or changing the subject. "Too long. Years, probably. I keep meaning to schedule an appointment, but there's always something more urgent at the clinic. Helen used to say that taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's responsible. She'd point out that we can't help others if we don't maintain our own health." Frank's eyes were kind but direct. "I think she was right, though I'm only now learning to follow her advice." Sarah arrived to open the clinic, followed shortly by Mike, and the normal rhythms of the day began to establish themselves. But throughout the morning's appointments, a routine vaccination for a nervous kitten, an elderly beagle's arthritis check, a rambunctious puppy's first wellness visit, Marjorie found herself thinking about Frank's question and her own honest answer. During lunch break, Frank was still there, having appointed himself the official coffee provider and unofficial therapy dog for anxious pet owners in the waiting room. Marjorie watched him through her office window as he comforted a young mother whose child was getting their first pet, offering gentle wisdom about the responsibilities and joys of animal companionship. "He's been here all day," Mike observed, joining her at the window. "Nice guy. Charlie's lucky to have someone who cares that much." "Yes, he is," Marjorie agreed, though she was beginning to think the feeling might be mutual. Later that afternoon, as they were closing up, Frank appeared in her office doorway holding his jacket and car keys. "I should probably head home and check on Charlie," he said. "But before I go, would you like to join us for dinner tomorrow? Nothing fancy, just something from Helen's recipe box. I've been working my way through them and I could use the company." The invitation was simple and genuine, free from any underlying pressure or expectation. It was the kind of offer that recognized the difference between being alone and being lonely, a distinction Marjorie was only now beginning to understand. "I'd like that very much," she found herself saying. "Good. 7 o'clock if that works. I'll text you my address." Frank paused in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "Marjorie, can I say something without overstepping?" She nodded. Helen always told her most stubborn patients that the bravest thing they could do was ask for help when they needed it. I think she was right about that too. After he left, Marjorie sat in her office surrounded by the familiar artifacts of her professional life. Her grandmother's medical bag, her father's diplomas on the wall, the countless thank you cards from grateful pet owners. But for the first time in years, she found herself thinking less about her responsibilities to others and more about her responsibility to herself. The recipe box had reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten, that caring for others was most meaningful when it came from a place of wholeness rather than self-sacrifice. Helen Morrison had understood that balance, and it seemed she'd passed that wisdom on to her husband, who was now offering it freely to someone who desperately needed to hear it. Tomorrow's dinner felt like more than just a meal. It felt like a first step towards something she'd been avoiding for too long, the courage to be vulnerable, to accept care, and to trust that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. Thursday evening found Marjorie standing in front of her bedroom mirror, second-guessing her choice of a simple navy cardigan and slacks for dinner at Frank's house. It had been so long since she'd accepted a social invitation that she'd forgotten how to dress for anything other than work or solitude. In her jewelry box lay a crumpled appointment reminder card from Dr. Patterson's office, the one she'd finally acted on after seeing Charlie's mysterious mass. Her Friday morning appointment was less than 12 hours away, and the anxiety was beginning to build like pressure behind her sternum. Frank's house was a modest ranch-style home on Maple Street, with a well-maintained garden and a front porch that suggested someone who took pride in creating a welcoming environment. Charlie greeted her at the door, his tail wagging despite the protective cone around his neck and the visible bandage on his flank. "He's been asking about you all day," Frank said, his smile warm and genuine. "I think you've made quite an impression on him." The interior of the house was comfortable and lived in, with photographs of Frank and Helen, spanning decades of marriage, displayed on every surface. Marjorie could see Helen's influence in the careful arrangement of furniture, the houseplants, thriving in sunny corners, and the way everything seemed designed for both comfort and conversation. "I hope you're hungry," Frank said, leading her toward the kitchen. "I decided to try Helen's pot roast recipe. She always claimed it was foolproof, though she never trusted me to make it without supervision." The kitchen smelled wonderful, filled with the rich aromas of slow-cooked beef and vegetables. On the counter sat the same wooden recipe box from yesterday, open to a card covered in Helen's careful handwriting. "She wrote very detailed instructions," Marjorie observed, reading over the recipe. "Helen never assumed anyone knew what she knew," Frank explained, stirring something on the stove. "She'd include notes like, 'Don't let Frank rush this step,' or 'Add extra carrots. They're his favorite." His voice carried fondness rather than sadness. Even her recipes were love letters. They settled at the dining room table with plates of perfectly tender pot roast, roasted vegetables, and homemade rolls that Frank admitted came from the freezer section of Helen's extensive meal prep efforts. Charlie positioned himself strategically, between their chairs, hope eternal despite his recent surgery. "This is delicious," Marjorie said, meaning it. Helen was clearly an excellent cook. "She was excellent at everything she set her mind to," Frank replied, "including taking care of stubborn men who thought they knew better than their doctors." The comment was made lightly, but Marjorie caught the underlying message. "Did she have to drag you to medical appointments?" Frank laughed, a sound both rueful and fond. Drag might be too gentle a word. Helen had a way of making her expectations very clear without ever raising her voice. She'd simply announce that she'd made me an appointment, and somehow I'd find myself in Dr. Patterson's office getting lectured about my blood pressure or cholesterol. "Dr. Patterson is my doctor too," Marjorie said. "I have an appointment with him tomorrow morning." "Do you? That's wonderful." Frank's approval was immediate and unguarded. "When was your last visit?" "Too long ago." She found herself sharing, more than she'd intended. "I've been putting it off for years, telling myself I'm too busy, too healthy, too something. But after what we found in Charlie yesterday, I realized I might be ignoring symptoms that I shouldn't ignore." Frank set down his fork and gave her his full attention. "What kind of symptoms?" "Fatigue, mostly. Some discomfort that I've been attributing to stress." She paused, then decided to trust him with the complete truth. "There's something I can feel when I examine myself, something that might be similar to what we found in Charlie." The admission felt both terrifying and liberating. She'd spoken the fear aloud for the first time, and Frank's steady presence made it feel less overwhelming than it had in her imagination. "I'm glad you're getting it checked," he said simply. "Helen always said that worry was just fear in disguise, and that most fear lost its power once you faced it directly. Your wife sounds like she was very wise." She was, but she was also human. Frank's expression grew thoughtful. "She waited too long to see someone about the symptoms that turned out to be her cancer. By the time she finally admitted something was wrong, treatment options were limited." "I'm sorry," Marjorie said softly. "Thank you. The regret is part of why I'm so grateful you're not making the same mistake." He reached across the table and briefly touched her hand. "Whatever tomorrow brings, you're not facing it alone." The simple gesture of human connection, warm fingers against her own, reminded Marjorie how long it had been since someone had offered her comfort instead of seeking it from her. The sensation was both foreign and deeply welcome. They talked through dinner about safer subjects, Charlie's recovery progress, funny stories from their respective careers, the changing character of their small town as younger families moved in and older residents moved on. But underneath the conversation ran a current of mutual recognition. Two people who'd spent their lives caring for others, finally acknowledging their own need for care. As the evening wound down, Frank packed leftovers for her to take home, insisting that Helen would have been horrified by the idea of a guest leaving empty-handed. At the door, Charlie pressed against her legs in farewell, his cone bumping gently against her hip. "Thank you for this," Marjorie said. "I needed the company more than I realized." "So did I," Frank admitted. "Charlie's great, but his conversation skills are limited." She laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Same time next week? I was hoping you'd ask. I'm planning to tackle Helen's famous lasagna recipe. Fair warning." She included a note that says, "Practice on people who won't complain if it's terrible." Driving home with containers of pot roast on her passenger seat and the lingering warmth of genuine friendship in her chest, Marjorie felt something shifting inside her. The appointment reminder card sat on her kitchen counter where she'd left it, but it no longer seemed like a symbol of impending doom. Instead, it felt like a promise, the first step toward treating herself with the same care and attention she'd always given others. Tomorrow would bring answers, whatever they might be. But tonight, for the first time in years, she wouldn't face her fears entirely alone. Friday morning arrived grey and drizzling, the kind of weather that seemed to mirror Marjorie's internal state as she sat in Dr. Patterson's waiting room. The framed photograph of her veterinary school mentors, Dr. Harrison and Dr. McBride watched. From her office wall in her memory, their stern faces representing decades of professional expectations she'd internalized long ago. At the clinic, that same photograph had witnessed countless moments of her refusing to show weakness, pushing through illness, and prioritizing every patient's needs above her own comfort. Now, sitting among Dr. Patterson's other patients, she felt like she was betraying those expectations by admitting she might need care herself. Dr. Lane, the nurse's voice was professionally cheerful. Dr. Patterson will see you now. James Patterson had been practicing family medicine in Millbrook for 25 years, arriving just a few years after Marjorie had joined her father's veterinary practice. They'd developed a mutual respect over the decades, consulting each other about zoonotic diseases and sharing the unique challenges of small-town medical practice. "Marjorie," he said warmly, gesturing for her to sit. "It's been too long since we've had you in here. What brings you by today?" She'd rehearsed this conversation during the sleepless hours before dawn, but the words still felt clumsy on her tongue. "I've been experiencing some symptoms that I've probably been ignoring longer than I should have." Dr. Patterson's expression shifted to professional attention. "What kind of symptoms?" "Fatigue, primarily. More than what I'd expect from a busy schedule. And there's—" She paused, finding it difficult to voice her deepest fear. "There's a mass I can palpate in my abdomen. It's been there for months. Maybe longer." "I see." His tone remained neutral, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Let's take a look." The examination was thorough and professional, but Marjorie found herself analyzing Dr. Patterson's expressions and subtle reactions with the same intensity she brought to diagnosing her animal patients. When his hands found the mass she'd been feeling, his careful palpation confirmed what she'd feared. It was real, significant, and worthy of serious investigation. "We need to get some imaging," he said after completing the examination. "I can get you scheduled for an ultrasound this afternoon, and we'll want blood work to check for tumor markers and general health indicators." The word tumor hung in the air between them like a diagnosis she wasn't ready to hear. "How serious do you think this might be?" "I don't want to speculate until we have more information," Dr. Patterson said kindly. "But I'm glad you came in when you did. Early detection makes all the difference, as I'm sure you know from your own field." The irony wasn't lost on her. How many times had she urged pet owners not to delay bringing their animals in for suspicious lumps or changes in behavior? How many times had she explained that waiting rarely improved outcomes? 3 hours later, she lay on an examination table. At the imaging center, ultrasound gel cold on her skin, while a technician moved the wand across her abdomen with practiced precision. The monitor showed ghostly black and white images that meant nothing to her untrained eye, though she tried to read meaning in the technician's neutral expressions. "The radiologist will have results for Dr. Patterson within a few hours," the technician explained. "You should hear something by early next week." By the time Marjorie returned to the clinic, the afternoon was half gone, and her absence had been noticed. Sarah looked up from the reception desk with concern clearly written on her face. "Everything all right, Dr. Lane?" Mike handled the morning. "Appointments, but Mrs. Chen has been asking specifically for you about her cat's medication." "I'm fine," Marjorie said automatically, then caught herself. "Actually, I had some medical tests done. I should have results early next week." Sarah's expression softened with understanding. "Is there anything I can do?" The simple offer of help from someone she'd worked with for 15 years nearly undid her careful composure. "Just keep things running smoothly. You always do." The rest of Friday passed in a blur of routine appointments and forced normalcy. Marjorie found herself going through the motions of her professional responsibilities while her mind remained fixed on ultrasound images and blood test results she wouldn't see for days. That evening, her phone buzzed with a text from Frank. "How did the appointment go? Charlie sends his regards." She stared at the message for several minutes, unsure how to respond. The truth was complicated and frightening. A casual response felt dishonest, but sharing her fears felt like admitting defeat before she even had a diagnosis. Finally, she typed, "Tests done, waiting for results. Thank you for asking." His response came quickly. "Waiting is the hardest part. Would you like company? I make excellent anxious tea." Despite everything, she smiled at his gentle humor. What exactly is anxious tea? Chamomile with honey, served with understanding silence or rambling stories about my teaching days, depending on what you need. She found herself typing an acceptance before she could second-guess the decision. 20 minutes later, Frank appeared at her front door carrying a thermos and a paper bag that smelled like fresh baked goods. "Mrs. Peterson's granddaughter is visiting," he explained, settling into her living room as if he belonged there. "She's been stress baking all week, and I was the lucky beneficiary. Chocolate chip cookies, still warm." They sat together on her couch, drinking tea and eating cookies, while Charlie dozed at their feet, his cone bumping gently against the coffee table whenever he shifted position. The conversation meandered through safe topics: the weather, upcoming, town events, Charlie's continued recovery, but underneath ran the steady current of mutual support. "Can I tell you something?" Frank said during a comfortable lull. "Of course. Helen went through a scare about 10 years before her actual diagnosis, a lump in her breast that turned out to be completely benign. But those weeks of waiting for results were some of the longest of our marriage." Marjorie looked at him, seeing the memory of old fear in his eyes. "What helped was talking about it," he continued. "Not obsessing over worst-case scenarios, but just acknowledging that the uncertainty was hard and that we didn't have to face it alone. I'm not very good at not facing things alone," she admitted. "Neither was Helen, until she learned to be. It's a skill like any other. It gets easier with practice." As the evening deepened, Marjorie felt something loosening in her chest, some tight knot of self-reliance beginning to unravel. For 37 years, she'd been the strong one, the expert, the person others turned to for answers. Learning to accept support felt foreign, but surprisingly comfortable, like settling into a chair she'd never known she needed. The weekend passed in a strange suspension of time, each hour stretching longer than seemed possible, while Marjorie waited for test results that wouldn't come until Monday. She'd thrown herself into deep cleaning the clinic, reorganizing supply, closets, and updating patient files with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that usually signaled her avoidance of larger issues. Sunday afternoon found her in Frank's living room again, this time helping him sort through a collection of papers he'd discovered in Helen's desk drawer. Among insurance documents and old tax returns, they'd found a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, correspondence between Frank and Helen during their brief courtship when he'd been teaching in Kansas City and she'd remained in Millbrook. "To finish nursing school. I'd forgotten these existed," Frank said, handling the letters with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "Helen kept everything, said memories deserved to be preserved properly." Marjorie watched him untie the ribbon with careful fingers, revealing envelopes addressed in his younger self's handwriting. The top letter was dated 45 years ago, when Frank had been 23 and Helen 21. "Would you mind if I read one?" he asked. "I'm curious what I sounded like at that age." She nodded, touched that he wanted to share this intimate piece of his history. Frank opened the first letter and began reading aloud, his mature voice giving weight to words written by a young man desperately in love. "My dearest Helen," he read, "Kansas City feels like a different planet when you're not here. I find myself counting the days until Christmas break, not because I need rest from teaching, but because I need to see your face and remember why everything else makes sense." He paused, looking up at Marjorie with a mixture of embarrassment and wonder. "I was quite dramatic, wasn't I?" "You were romantic," she corrected gently. "There's a difference." He continued reading, and the letters painted a picture of a young couple navigating the challenges of separation, career decisions, and the gradual building of a life together. Frank's letters revealed a capacity for emotional expression that impressed Marjorie. He wrote about his fears, his hopes, his daily struggles with student behavior and lesson planning, and always his deep longing to build a future with Helen. "Listen to this," Frank said, opening another envelope. "I know we've talked about not having children, about how fulfilled we both feel with our careers and each other. But sometimes I watch my students and wonder if we're missing something important. Not that I need more than what we have. You're enough family for me. But I wonder if love like ours is meant to be shared more widely." Marjorie felt a sharp pang of recognition. She'd had similar thoughts over the years. Moments when she wondered if her devotion to animal patients and their families was a substitute for more traditional forms of connection. "Did you ever regret not having children?" she asked. Frank considered the question seriously. "Not regret, exactly. But I did sometimes wonder what that kind of love would have felt like. Helen and I poured ourselves into our students and patients. Instead, she always said we raised hundreds of children together, just not in the traditional way." "I've felt that way about the animals I've cared for," Marjorie admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if I chose veterinary medicine because it was a way to nurture without the complications of human relationships. And now, do you still feel that way?" The question was asked gently, but it cut straight to something Marjorie had been avoiding examining too closely. Her growing friendship with Frank, the way she'd begun to crave his company and rely on his support, suggested that perhaps she'd been missing more than she'd admitted to herself. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "This past week, having someone to talk to about my fears and uncertainties, it's been different from anything I've experienced. Good different, but also frightening." Frank set the letters aside and gave her his full attention. "What frightens you about it?" "Dependency. I suppose I've been self-sufficient for so long that needing someone else feels like admitting failure." She paused, searching for words to explain feelings she was only beginning to understand. "And there's the practical concern. What if my test results are serious? It wouldn't be fair to burden someone with that kind of responsibility when they're still grieving their own loss." "Marjorie," Frank said quietly, "do you think taking care of Helen during her illness was a burden?" "Of course not. But that was different. You'd been married for decades. You had vows and history, and we had love," Frank interrupted gently. "The vows and history were important, but love was what made caring for her feel like privilege rather than obligation." The simple statement hung between them, heavy with implication. Marjorie found herself studying Frank's weathered hands as he carefully retied the ribbon around Helen's letters, noting the way he handled these remnants of his greatest love with such tender reverence. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Finally." "Do what?" "Any of it. Be vulnerable. Accept help. Consider the possibility that someone might want to share whatever comes next with me." Frank smiled, the expression transforming his whole face. "Neither did Helen when we first started dating. She'd been independent her whole life, putting herself through nursing school, taking care of her aging parents. The idea of partnership felt foreign to her. What changed her mind? Time, mostly, and the gradual realization that sharing burdens didn't make them heavier, it made them manageable. That sharing joys didn't diminish them, it multiplied them. Charlie stirred at their feet, lifting his head to look between them with the kind of intuitive understanding that dogs possessed about human emotions. His cone had come off that morning, and he seemed more like his old self, alert, affectionate, and subtly protective of both the humans who had cared for him through his ordeal. "Your phone is ringing," Frank observed. Marjorie looked at her cell phone display and felt her heart rate spike. Dr. Patterson's office was calling on Sunday evening, which could only mean one thing. Her results were back, and they couldn't. "Wait until Monday," she answered with hands that trembled slightly. "This is Dr. Lane." "Dr. Lane, this is Dr. Patterson. I have your test results, and I'd like to schedule you to come in first thing Monday morning to discuss them. Can you be here at 8 o'clock? The careful neutrality of his tone told her nothing and everything. "Of course. Is everything? We'll talk tomorrow morning," he said kindly. "Try to get some rest tonight." As she hung up, Frank reached over and took her hand. "Whatever it is, you're not facing it alone." Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if nature itself was offering encouragement for the difficult conversation ahead. Frank had insisted on driving Marjorie to Dr. Patterson's office, and she'd found herself grateful for his steady presence in the passenger seat beside her. "Whatever we learn today," he said, as they pulled into the medical building's parking lot, "it's just information we can work with." Dr. Patterson's office felt different this time, smaller. Somehow, though nothing had changed except Marjorie's perspective. The same magazines sat on the same tables, the same motivational posters about healthy living decorated the walls, but everything seemed sharper, more significant. "Dr. Lane?" The nurse appeared with a smile that seemed carefully calibrated to reveal nothing. "Dr. Patterson is ready for you." Frank squeezed her hand briefly before she stood. "I'll be right here." Dr. Patterson looked tired, she noticed, as if he'd spent a difficult weekend reviewing test results and preparing for conversations no doctor enjoyed having. He gestured for her to sit, then settled behind his desk with a manila folder that contained her future. "Thank you for coming in so early," he began. "I wanted to discuss your results before your regular day started." "Just tell me," Marjorie said, surprising herself with her directness. "Is it cancer?" Dr. Patterson opened the folder and pulled out what appeared to be a second pathology report, different from the one she'd expected, with letterhead from the University Medical Center. "That's what we thought we were looking for," he said carefully. "The initial blood work showed some markers that were concerning, and the ultrasound revealed a complex mass that had characteristics we associate with malignancy." Marjorie felt her world tilting, the familiar ground of her assumptions shifting beneath her feet. But we sent your imaging and blood samples for additional analysis because something didn't fit the typical pattern." Dr. Patterson leaned forward, his expression shifting from concerned to puzzled. "What you have isn't cancer, Marjorie. It's something much rarer and frankly much more manageable." She stared at him, her mind struggling to process information that contradicted every fear she'd been carrying for days. "I don't understand. The mass in your abdomen is what's called a pseudomyxoma, a collection of mucin-producing cells that have formed a benign but complex growth. It's incredibly rare, seen in maybe 1 in a million people. The symptoms you've been experiencing, the fatigue, the discomfort, they're related to chronic stress and what appears to be severe iron deficiency, not the mass itself. But the blood markers were elevated because of the iron deficiency and some autoimmune activity your body has been mounting in response to chronic stress. When we put it all together, you're dealing with the physical consequences of putting everyone else's needs before your own for several decades." The irony was almost too much to process. She'd been terrified of a death sentence, only to learn that her real diagnosis was a life sentence, one that required her to fundamentally change how she approached self-care. "So I'm not dying?" "Not from this, no. The pseudomyxoma will need to be monitored with regular imaging, but it's not expected to cause significant problems. The iron deficiency can be corrected with supplements and dietary changes. The stress response," Dr. Patterson paused meaningfully, "requires more comprehensive lifestyle modifications." Marjorie sat in stunned silence, her carefully constructed fears crumbling to reveal a different kind of challenge underneath. "How do I fix something I've been doing for 37 years? The same way you'd treat any other chronic condition," Dr. Patterson said gently. "With patience, consistency, and support from people who care about you." When she emerged from the office, Frank took one look at her face and immediately stood. "What did he say?" "I'm not dying," she said, the words feeling surreal on her tongue. "It's not cancer. It's something called pseudomyxoma, and it's benign. The real problem is that I've been slowly killing myself with stress and neglect." Frank's relief was visible, his shoulders dropping as tension she hadn't realized he'd been carrying finally released. That's wonderful news. Complicated, but wonderful. Is it? I spent all weekend preparing for the worst, and instead I'm facing something that might be harder to fix, changing everything about how I live my life. They walked to the car in contemplative silence, both processing the unexpected turn their fears had taken. As Frank started the engine, Marjorie's phone buzzed with a call from the clinic. Dr. Lane. Sarah's voice was excited. I just got a call from the university lab about Charlie Morrison's pathology results. Dr. Stevens wants to speak with you immediately. He says it's extraordinary. We'll be right there, Marjorie said, glancing at Frank. Charlie's results are back. 20 minutes later, they were sitting in Marjorie's office while Dr. Stevens explained Charlie's condition over speakerphone, his academic excitement evident even through the static connection. What Charlie had is being called a benign xenolithic deposit, Dr. Stevens said. It's never been documented in canine literature. The mass was essentially a collection of mineralized proteins that his body encapsulated rather than absorbed. We think it might be related to environmental exposure to certain rare earth elements, possibly from old mining operations in your area. Is Charlie going to be all right? Frank asked. Better than all right. His body's response to isolating and encapsulating the foreign material was textbook perfect. He's essentially cured himself. But here's the remarkable part. This case is so rare that we'd like to document it for publication. Dr. Lane, your surgical technique and diagnostic instincts caught something that could advance veterinary understanding of environmental toxicology. Marjorie felt something shifting inside her chest, a sensation she couldn't immediately identify. You want to publish Charlie's case? We want to co-author a paper with you. This could be presented at the National Veterinary Conference next spring. Your small-town practice just discovered something that could have implications for animal health nationwide. After Dr. Stevens ended the call, Frank and Marjorie sat in silence, both absorbing the morning's unexpected revelations. Charlie, meanwhile, had positioned himself between their chairs, his recovery complete and his demeanor suggesting he was entirely unaware of his contribution to veterinary science. So, let me understand this, Frank said finally. Charlie had something incredibly rare, but ultimately harmless. You have something incredibly rare, but ultimately manageable. And both discoveries might end up helping others. That appears to be the situation. And we spent all weekend terrified of outcomes that weren't actually the real challenge we were facing. Marjorie looked at him, seeing her own bewilderment reflected in his weathered features. The real challenge is learning to live differently, to accept help, to put my own health and happiness on equal footing with everyone else's. To consider that maybe partnership isn't weakness, but wisdom, Frank added quietly. The second pathology report sat on her desk between them, its unexpected conclusions reframing everything they'd believed about their situation. What had seemed like an ending was actually a beginning, not just for Charlie's contribution to veterinary science, but for the possibility that Marjorie might finally learn to care for herself with the same dedication she'd always given others. And perhaps, if she was brave enough to let someone else help her do it. 3 months later, Marjorie sat at her desk, staring at a manuscript that had taken on a life of its own. What had started as a simple case report about Charlie's unusual condition had evolved into a comprehensive research paper examining environmental toxicology in rural veterinary practice. The document represented everything she'd spent her career avoiding: public recognition, professional scrutiny, and the vulnerability that came with putting her work on display for the entire veterinary community to examine. The Veterinary Journal. Manuscript lay open beside her laptop, its pages covered with Frank's careful editorial suggestions in red ink. His background as an English teacher had proven invaluable in helping her translate her medical expertise into language that would engage both specialist and general audiences. Their collaboration had surprised them both with its natural rhythm. Her technical precision balanced by his gift for narrative clarity. "Are you having second thoughts?" Frank asked from the chair beside her desk, where he'd taken to spending most afternoons since Charlie's recovery had made him a regular fixture at the clinic. "Third and fourth thoughts," Marjorie admitted. "When Dr. Stevens first suggested publication, it seemed like an abstract possibility. Now that we have a submission deadline next week and the National Veterinary Conference has accepted our presentation and proposal, it feels terrifyingly real." She gestured at the acceptance letter from the conference committee, which had arrived that morning with news that their presentation had been selected for the main scientific program. In 6 weeks, she would be standing in front of 500 veterinary professionals, discussing Charlie's case and its implications for environmental health monitoring in companion animals. Helen used to say that the things worth doing were usually the things that scared us most, Frank observed, reaching over to scratch Charlie's ears. The golden retriever had become the clinic's unofficial mascot, greeting nervous pets and their owners with the calm confidence of an animal who'd survived something extraordinary and lived to tell about it. Easy for her to say. She wasn't facing a room full of experts who might find fundamental flaws in her reasoning. No, she was facing rooms full of injured children and worried parents who trusted her to make life or death decisions about their most precious possessions. Frank's voice carried the quiet pride of someone who'd watched his partner excel under pressure for decades. She learned that expertise wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about caring enough to do your best work and trusting others to recognize that dedication. Marjorie saved her latest revisions and closed the laptop, her mind too restless to focus on technical details. The past 3 months had been a period of adjustment that went far beyond preparing for professional recognition. Dr. Patterson's treatment plan for her iron deficiency and stress-related symptoms had required changes that touched every aspect of her daily routine. The iron supplements had been the easy part, rebuilding her energy levels and addressing the chronic fatigue that had become so normal. She'd forgotten what true vitality felt like, was more complex. But the real challenge had been implementing the lifestyle modifications Dr. Patterson had prescribed: regular meals, adequate sleep, scheduled time off, and most difficult of all, learning to delegate responsibilities she'd always handled alone. Sarah had stepped into an expanded role as office manager, taking over scheduling and administrative duties that Marjorie had micromanaged for years. Mike had proven himself capable of handling routine procedures and emergencies with minimal supervision, his confidence growing as Marjorie learned to trust his judgment. The clinic had not only survived her reduced control, it had thrived with the more collaborative approach. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," she confessed to Frank, as they prepared to leave for the day. "For a case I should have handled. And personally to go badly because I wasn't directly involved. And has that happened? No. If anything, Mike and Sarah seem more engaged now that they have real responsibility instead of just following my instructions." Frank smiled, the expression she'd come to associate with his gentle way of pointing out truths she was still learning to accept. "It's almost as if other people are competent professionals who were just waiting for permission to show what they could do. You don't have to sound so smug about being right. I learned from 40 years of teaching that being right isn't nearly as satisfying as watching someone discover something important about themselves." They drove to Frank's house for dinner, a routine that had developed naturally over the months since Charlie's surgery. Marjorie's own kitchen had barely been used for anything more elaborate than coffee and toast, but Frank's house had become a place where she could experience the simple pleasure of sharing meals with someone who cared about her well-being as much as her professional success. Tonight's menu came from Helen's recipe box, a complex beef stew that required hours of slow cooking and the kind of patient attention that had become Frank's meditation. He'd adapted several of Helen's recipes to accommodate Marjorie's new dietary requirements, adding iron-rich ingredients and reducing sodium to support her recovery. Dr. Stevens called this afternoon, Marjorie mentioned, as they settled at the dining table. He's arranged for Charlie to be present at the conference presentation. Apparently, having the actual patient there will add significant impact to our case study. Charlie will love the attention, Frank said, glancing at his companion, who was demonstrating his complete recovery by attempting to convince them that he'd never been fed in his entire life. How do you feel about having him there? Grateful, actually. If I start to panic, I can look at him and remember why we're doing this. He's living proof that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries come from the most routine moments. After dinner, they settled in the living room with cups of Frank's excellent coffee and the conference presentation materials spread across the coffee table. Charlie positioned himself strategically between the couch and the fireplace, his presence a calming reminder of how far they'd all traveled from that anxious Tuesday morning in the surgery suite. "Read me the abstract one more time," Frank requested, pulling on his reading glasses. "I want to hear how it sounds when you say it out loud." Marjorie picked up the printed summary of their research, her voice growing stronger as she read the technical language that described Charlie's condition and its broader implications for veterinary medicine. By the time she reached the conclusion, her natural teaching instincts had taken over, and she found herself explaining rather than simply reciting. "That's how you need to present it," Frank said when she finished. "Not as someone defending their work, but as someone sharing knowledge that could help other animals and their families. I'm not sure I know the difference. The difference is between fear and purpose. When you were reading just now, you forgot to be nervous because you were focused on the importance of what you'd learned." She considered this, recognizing the truth in his observation. Her years of explaining diagnoses and treatment options to worried pet owners had prepared her for this kind of communication. She'd simply never applied those skills to her professional peers. "There's something else," she said, setting down the manuscript. Dr. Stevens mentioned that several other veterinarians have submitted cases with similar environmental findings after reading our preliminary report. Our work might be part of a larger pattern of environmental health issues that the profession hasn't fully recognized. Frank's eyes brightened with the kind of pride she was still learning to accept. So Charlie's case isn't just medically interesting, it could be the beginning of important changes in how veterinarians approach environmental health. That's what makes it so terrifying. If we're right, this presentation could influence how thousands of veterinarians think about diagnosis and environmental factors. If you're wrong, you'll have contributed to the scientific process by testing a hypothesis with rigor and integrity, Frank interrupted gently. That's how knowledge advances, through careful observation, thoughtful analysis, and the courage to share findings even when outcomes are uncertain. As the evening progressed toward their usual parting time, Marjorie realized that the manuscript on the coffee table no longer felt like an instrument of potential humiliation. Instead, it had become what Frank suggested, a way of sharing knowledge that might help other animals and their families avoid unnecessary suffering. The transformation from private practitioner to published researcher felt as significant as her personal journey from isolated caregiver to someone learning to accept partnership and support. Both changes required the same fundamental shift, the willingness to be vulnerable, to trust others with her imperfections, and to believe that her contributions had value beyond her own small world. Charlie lifted his head from his favorite spot by the fireplace, his recovered health a daily reminder that extraordinary discoveries often emerged from ordinary moments of careful attention. In 6 weeks, his story would be shared with veterinarians from around the country, potentially influencing how they approached similar cases in their own practices. But tonight, he was simply a beloved companion whose recovery had taught his humans that healing, whether physical, professional, or emotional, required both courage and community. The conference presentation would be their chance to share that lesson with others who had dedicated their lives to the same calling that had shaped Marjorie's entire adult identity. The manuscript was ready. Charlie was ready. Now she needed to find the courage to trust that she was ready too. The Denver Convention Center buzzed with the controlled energy of 1,000 veterinary professionals gathering for their annual conference. Marjorie stood in the speaker preparation room, her conference badge hanging around her neck like a declaration of intent she wasn't entirely sure she was ready to make. The simple plastic rectangle bore her name and title, but more significantly, it represented her first step into professional visibility after decades of comfortable anonymity. Frank adjusted his own visitor's badge and offered her a cup of coffee that she accepted with hands that betrayed only the slightest tremor. "How are you feeling?" "Like I might forget everything I've learned about veterinary medicine the moment I see that audience," she admitted, glancing through the small window that offered a view into the main presentation hall. Rows of seats were filling with colleagues she recognized from journals and conferences she'd attended as a silent observer over the years. "Charlie seems confident enough for both of you," Frank observed. Indeed, Charlie appeared to be enjoying his role as conference mascot, accepting attention from passing veterinarians with the regal composure of an animal who understood his importance to the proceedings. His golden coat had been professionally groomed for the occasion, and his calm demeanor suggested he was entirely comfortable being the center of scientific attention. Dr. Stevens appeared in the doorway, his academic enthusiasm barely contained by professional courtesy. "The audience is quite impressive," he reported. "We have practitioners from 43 states, 3 Canadian provinces, and several international colleagues who came specifically to hear about environmental toxicology cases." "No pressure there," Marjorie murmured. "Think of it as validation," Dr. Stevens continued. "The veterinary community recognizes that your work represents something significant. That's why they're here." Through the window, Marjorie could see colleagues taking their seats, many of them holding printed copies of the pre-conference materials that included her research summary. Some were making notes in the margins, others were engaged in animated discussions that she hoped were focused on scientific curiosity rather than skeptical criticism. "5 minutes, Dr. Lane," a conference organizer announced from the hallway. Frank squeezed her shoulder gently. "Remember what you told me when Charlie was going into surgery. You've prepared for this. You know the material better than anyone else in that room, and you're doing it for all the right reasons." She nodded, gathering her presentation materials, and taking a deep breath that carried the mixed aromas of coffee, nervous energy, and the distinctive scent of a building filled with people who had dedicated their lives to animal welfare. It was a comforting combination, reminiscent of every veterinary conference she'd ever attended as a participant rather than a presenter. "Dr. Lane?" The conference coordinator appeared beside them. "We're ready for you." The walk from the preparation room to the presentation stage felt simultaneously endless and instantaneous. Marjorie was aware of conversations quieting as she passed, of colleagues she'd known for years, offering encouraging smiles and gentle nods of recognition. Charlie padded beside her with perfect composure, as if he'd been attending veterinary conferences his entire life. The podium stood at the center of a stage that felt larger than it had appeared from the preparation room. Behind her, a large screen displayed the title of their presentation, Environmental Xenolithic Deposits in Companion Animals, a Case Study in Rural Environmental Health Monitoring. Marjorie stepped to the microphone and looked out over an audience that had grown beyond her initial estimate. The main hall was full, with additional colleagues standing along the walls and others gathered in the doorway. These were her peers, practitioners who faced the same daily challenges of diagnosis, treatment, and the emotional complexity of caring for beloved family members who happened to have 4 legs. "Good morning," she began, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. My name is Dr. Marjorie Lane, and this is Charlie Morrison, whose unusual case brought us all together today. Charlie, as if responding to his introduction, settled into a perfect sit beside the podium, his tail wagging just enough to suggest his pleasure at being acknowledged without disrupting the serious atmosphere of scientific presentation. 3 months ago, I expected to remove a routine lipoma from Charlie's flank, Marjorie continued, finding her rhythm as the familiar process of explaining medical conditions to concerned audiences took over her nervous system. What we discovered instead was something that challenged everything I thought I knew about environmental health in companion animal practice. She clicked to her first slide, which showed the pre-surgical examination photos of Charlie's seemingly innocuous lump. The initial presentation was entirely consistent with a benign fatty tumor. Charlie was in good health, eating normally, maintaining his usual activity level. His owner brought him in because the mass had grown slightly over the course of several months. The audience was attentive, their body language suggesting the kind of engaged focus that Marjorie recognized from her own experience as a conference attendee. These were practitioners who understood the weight of diagnostic uncertainty, who had their own stories of cases that defied initial expectations. However, when I made the initial incision, she continued, advancing to the surgical photographs that had started this entire journey, what we found was unlike anything in my 37 years of practice. The image on the screen showed the strange, multicolored mass that had stopped her surgical procedure and initiated the research that brought them all to this moment. A murmur of professional interest rippled through the audience, the sound of colleagues recognizing something extraordinary when they saw it. The presentation hall had fallen into the kind of focused silence that every teacher recognizes, the moment when an audience stops being politely attentive and becomes genuinely engaged. Marjorie advanced through her slides methodically, explaining the pathology results and the environmental investigation that had led to their groundbreaking conclusions about xenolithic deposits in companion animals. The mineralized proteins we found in Charlie's mass showed trace elements consistent with rare earth mining operations that occurred in our region between 1952 and 1967, she continued, her confidence building as she moved deeper into the technical material that represented months of collaborative research. What makes this case extraordinary is not just the rarity of the condition, but Charlie's body's perfect encapsulation response. She gestured toward Charlie, who seemed to understand his role as living evidence, and responded with a gentle wag that drew appreciative smiles from the audience. As you can see, he has recovered completely from the surgical removal, with no complications and no recurrence of symptoms. His case suggests that companion animals may serve as early indicators for environmental health risks that could affect both animal and human populations. Dr. Stevens had joined her on stage for the collaborative portion of their presentation, and now he stepped forward to address the broader implications of their findings. Since Dr. Lane's initial case report was circulated to the veterinary pathology community, we've received 17 similar cases from practices in former mining regions across the Midwest and Southwest. A murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. This was new information, data that had emerged in the weeks since their original submission. The pattern suggests that what Dr. Lane discovered in her small-town practice may be the tip of a much larger iceberg, Dr. Stevens continued. We're looking at the possibility that companion animals are serving as sentinels for environmental health risks that have been overlooked by traditional monitoring systems. Marjorie returned to the podium for the final portion of their presentation, where she would share the personal and professional insights that had emerged from Charlie's case. This was the part she'd been most nervous about, moving beyond pure scientific data to discuss the broader implications for veterinary practice. Charlie's case taught me something important about the nature of discovery in veterinary medicine. She said, looking out over the sea of familiar faces, sometimes the most significant findings come not from complex diagnostic procedures or cutting-edge technology, but from careful attention to what seems routine and ordinary. She paused, gathering courage for the more personal elements of her message. Frank's supportive presence in the front row gave her strength to continue. I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 37 years, and I believed I'd developed reliable instincts about common conditions like lipomas. Charlie's case reminded me that expertise isn't about having all the answers. It's about maintaining the curiosity and humility to question our assumptions when the evidence suggests we might be wrong. The audience was nodding now, recognizing the kind of professional wisdom that came from decades of practice, combined with continued willingness to learn. But perhaps more importantly, Marjorie continued, her voice growing stronger as she approached her conclusion, this case taught me that the most meaningful discoveries often emerge from collaborative efforts. The pathology expertise of Dr. Stevens and his team, the environmental research conducted by colleagues at 3 different universities, and even the editorial support of my friend Frank Morrison. She gestured toward Frank, who smiled encouragingly. All contributed to transforming an unusual surgical finding into research that might benefit animals and their families across the country. She clicked to her final slide, which showed a recent photograph of Charlie playing fetch in Frank's backyard, his recovery complete and his quality of life restored. Charlie reminds us that behind every case study, every research finding, every scientific breakthrough, there are real families whose lives are affected by our work. Our responsibility as veterinarians extends beyond treating individual patients to sharing knowledge that might prevent suffering and improve outcomes for animals we'll never meet. The applause began slowly, then built to the kind of sustained recognition that indicated genuine appreciation rather than polite acknowledgement. Colleagues stood throughout the hall, their approval reflecting not just respect for the scientific work, but recognition of the courage required to step forward and share expertise with the broader community. During the question and answer period that followed, Marjorie fielded inquiries about methodology, follow-up research plans, and practical applications with the same calm competence she brought to explaining diagnoses to worried pet owners. Each answer reinforced her growing confidence that she belonged in this setting, that her work had value beyond the boundaries of her small-town practice. Charlie maintained his perfect behavior throughout the extended session, accepting attention from colleagues who wanted to meet the famous patient and seeming to enjoy his role as a bridge between scientific abstraction and the real animals whose health depended on continued veterinary research. As the formal presentation concluded, Marjorie was surrounded by colleagues offering congratulations, sharing similar cases from their own practices, and expressing interest in collaborative research opportunities. The isolation she'd maintained for decades had transformed into connection, her expertise finally recognized as a valuable contribution to the profession she'd served quietly for so long. Frank appeared at her side as the crowd began to disperse, his pride evident in every line of his weathered face. How does it feel to be a published researcher and conference presenter? Like something I should have done years ago, she admitted, but also like something I couldn't have done without. Learning to accept help from people who believed in me. 6 months after the Denver conference, a new sign hung outside the veterinary clinic on Main Street. Lane and Associates Veterinary Medicine gleamed in fresh gold lettering, the updated signage reflecting changes that went far deeper than simple professional expansion. The word associates represented not just the addition of 2 new veterinarians to the practice, but Marjorie's fundamental shift from solitary practitioner to collaborative leader. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had joined them straight from veterinary school, drawn by the opportunity to work with the practice that had published the groundbreaking environmental health research. Dr. Marcus Chen, with 15 years of emergency medicine experience, had relocated from Chicago specifically to help develop the environmental toxicology program that had emerged from Charlie's case. Marjorie stood in her office, reviewing the morning's patient schedule with a cup of coffee that had actually been allowed to cool to drinkable temperature, a small victory in her ongoing campaign to treat herself with the same care she provided to others. The morning ritual of unhurried coffee had become symbolic of larger changes in how she approached both work and life. "The Henderson family is here with Duchess," Sarah announced from the doorway. "Her arthritis medication has been working so well that she's started chasing squirrels again. Mrs. Henderson wants to thank you personally." "Send them back in 5 minutes," Marjorie said, closing the patient file she'd been reviewing. "And Sarah, thank you for handling the new patient. Intake forms, having that done before appointments, has made everything run more smoothly." Sarah beamed at the acknowledgement, her expanded responsibilities having transformed her from receptionist to office manager with a pride that was evident in every interaction with clients and colleagues. Through her window, Marjorie could see Frank in the clinic's small garden, where he'd volunteered to maintain the healing space they'd created for clients who needed quiet moments with their pets. Charlie supervised from his favorite spot under the oak tree, his complete recovery having made him something of a local celebrity among both veterinary colleagues and town residents. The morning appointments flowed with the easy rhythm that had developed since Marjorie had learned to delegate routine procedures and focus her attention on complex cases and mentoring her new associates. Dr. Walsh handled the wellness visits with enthusiasm and competence, while Dr. Chen managed the more challenging medical cases with the kind of steady expertise that reminded Marjorie of her younger self. During lunch break, Frank appeared in her office carrying a familiar thermos and a manila envelope that bore the logo of the American Veterinary Medical Association. "The latest issue arrived," he said, presenting the journal with the kind of ceremony reserved for momentous occasions. Marjorie opened the envelope and withdrew the journal, her breath catching, as she saw their research featured on the cover. Environmental sentinel species, companion animals, as early indicators of regional health risks, was highlighted as the lead article with a photograph of Charlie prominently displayed. "Page 47, Frank said, settling into the chair beside her desk. "I may have already read it 3 times. She turned to their article. Seeing their names in print still felt surreal after months of anticipation. The research had evolved far beyond Charlie's individual case, to encompass the 17 similar cases that had emerged from practices across the country, creating a comprehensive database of environmental health indicators that was already influencing diagnostic protocols in veterinary schools. "Listen to this," she said, reading from the editor's introduction. "Dr. Lane's work represents the kind of observational excellence that drives meaningful advancement in veterinary medicine. Her willingness to look beyond routine assumptions and share her findings has created a new framework for understanding companion animals as partners in environmental health monitoring." Frank's smile carried the particular satisfaction of someone who had watched a person they cared about receive long overdue recognition. "Helen would have been proud to see you getting the acknowledgement your work deserves." The afternoon brought a steady stream of patients, each case a reminder of why she'd chosen veterinary medicine in the first place. But now, instead of carrying the full weight of diagnosis and treatment alone, she worked as part of a team that amplified rather than diminished her effectiveness. As evening approached, the clinic settled into the peaceful rhythm of closing. Procedures. Dr. Walsh and Dr. Chen had handled their cases with growing confidence, consulting with Marjorie on complex decisions, but demonstrating the independent judgment that marked competent practitioners. "Dinner tonight?" Frank asked as they prepared to leave. "I found one of Helen's more ambitious recipes that I've been afraid to attempt without moral support. As long as you're not expecting me to provide cooking expertise." Marjorie replied, her easy acceptance of the invitation reflecting how naturally their partnership had developed over the months since Charlie's surgery. They walked to Frank's house together, Charlie padding contentedly between them, while the setting sun painted the small town in shades of gold that suggested both completion and continuation. The evening air carried the promise of spring, with early flowers beginning to emerge in carefully tended gardens throughout the neighborhood. Helen's recipe box sat open on the kitchen counter, its contents no longer a source of intimidation, but a collection of possibilities for shared meals and gentle adventures in domestic collaboration. Frank had mastered most of the simpler dishes and was gradually working his way toward the more complex entries that Helen had marked with encouraging notes about patience and practice. As they prepared dinner together, Frank handling the cooking, while Marjorie managed the easier tasks of setting the table and keeping Charlie from investigating every interesting smell. Marjorie reflected on how much had changed since that anxious Tuesday morning when a routine surgery had revealed something extraordinary. The scared, isolated woman who had discovered Charlie's mysterious mass had been replaced by someone who understood that strength and vulnerability were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a fully lived life. The veterinarian who had spent decades avoiding professional recognition had found her voice as a researcher and educator whose work was already influencing practices across the country. Most significantly, the person who had believed that caring for others required sacrificing herself had learned that the most sustainable compassion grew from a foundation of self-respect and mutual support. Charlie settled beside their table as they shared Helen's successfully recreated casserole, his presence a daily reminder that healing, whether medical, professional, or emotional, was rarely a solitary endeavor. Sometimes the most important discoveries emerged from the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to accept help, and the recognition that partnership multiplied rather than diminished individual strength. Outside the kitchen window, the new clinic sign was visible in the distance, its fresh lettering reflecting not just professional growth, but personal transformation. Lane and Associates represented everything Marjorie had learned about the power of collaboration, the importance of legacy, and the possibility that it was never too late to write a new chapter in a life dedicated to healing.